May 12, 1895, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Eufaula, Alabama, where the heat presses down like wet wool and the air tastes of river mud and cotton dust. On North Eufaula Avenue, smoke pours from the second-story windows of a mansion that took 11 years to build. Inside, hand-carved walnut banisters blacken and curl. Imported marble mantels crack in the heat. The parquet floors, mahogany, oak, and walnut, laid in 3 patterns by craftsmen whose names were never recorded, pop and splinter as flames eat through $5,000 worth of careful work. Eli Shorter stands in the street watching his house burn. He's 37 years old. His wife Wilena is beside him, her face blank. They've been married 12 years. The house was a wedding gift to themselves, built with money from medicine bottles. SSS. Tonic, sold in every drugstore from Atlanta to New York, promising to cure blood disease, rheumatism, scrofula, any ailment you could name. The bottles were amber glass. The liquid inside was mostly alcohol and plant extracts. The promises were pure vapor. But the profits were real, and the profits built this house. Now it's ash. The question nobody asks out loud: was this house ever meant to stand, or was it always destined to burn? When you build a palace on bottles of false hope, who pays the real price? The builder, or everyone who believed? If you're fascinated by the hidden stories behind America's grandest historic homes and the controversial fortunes that built them, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with which historic mansion or estate I should investigate next. Your support keeps these deep dives coming. Let's dive in. The Chattahoochee River runs through Alabama like a scar, brown and slow and indifferent. By the 1820s, white settlers had pushed the Creek Indians off the high bluffs overlooking the water, and in 1823, they founded a town. They called it Eufaula, after the Eufaula band of Muskogee Creeks who'd lived there for generations, a name that supposedly meant high bluff in the Creek language. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. You take the land, you take the name, you rewrite the story. By the 1830s, Eufaula was a shipping center. Cotton came down from plantations 50 miles inland, loaded onto steamboats at the river landing, and floated south to Apalachicola, Florida, then across the ocean to Liverpool and New York. Money flowed back upstream. The town grew fat on cotton profits. By the 1850s, Eufaula was one of Alabama's primary trading centers. Elegant homes rose along the avenues. Greek Revival, Italianate, mansions with columns and balconies and gardens, built by planters and merchants who'd made fortunes moving other people's labor. The town even spawned its own political machine, the Eufaula Regency, a group of lawyers and planters who pushed hard for secession. When the Civil War came, 6 companies of soldiers marched out of Barber County to fight for the Confederacy. One of the Regency's most prominent members, John Gill Shorter, served as governor of Alabama from 1861 to 63. The war didn't touch Eufaula directly. On April 29, 1865, when Union General Benjamin Grierson marched 4,000 cavalry toward the town, the mayor rode out under a white flag with news that Johnston had surrendered to Sherman, Lee to Grant. The war was over. The troops marched peacefully through town and camped across the river in Georgia. Eufaula remained intact, its people unharmed, its houses standing. But the economy didn't survive so cleanly. Cotton production collapsed after emancipation. Plantations that had run on enslaved labor couldn't function on tenant farming alone. The river trade slowed. By the 1870s, Eufaula's fortunes had dimmed considerably, but then something changed. The town began to recover, slowly at first, then faster. Cotton mills opened, railroads replaced steamboats as the primary means of shipping, and new fortunes were being made, not from land this time, but from commerce, from industry, from selling things people thought they needed. Patent medicines were part of that new economy, and one family, the Shorters, would ride that economy all the way to the top. Eli Sims Shorter wasn't the first in his family to make a name in Alabama. His father, also named Eli Sims Shorter, had been a U.S. congressman from 1855 to 59, a Yale-educated lawyer who'd made a fortune in land and law. His uncle, John Gill Shorter, had been that wartime governor. The Shorter family was Alabama aristocracy, connected, educated, powerful. Eli Shorter II, born in 1858, grew up in the shadow of that legacy. He attended Howard College in Marion, Alabama, graduating in 1874 with plans to practice law like his father and uncle. But Eli didn't practice law. Instead, he became a cotton broker, buying and selling bales in the post-war boom. It was steady work, respectable work, but it wasn't spectacular. What changed everything was his marriage. In December of 1883, Eli married Wylena Lamar in Macon, Georgia. She was 22 years old, the daughter of Colonel Henry J. Lamar and Valeria Bathsheba Jones Lamar. Valeria was the heir to the SSS Tonic Company, one of the most profitable patent medicine operations in the South. The tonic had been around since 1826, supposedly based on a remedy given by Creek Indians to a Captain Irwin Dennard of Perry, Georgia, after he saved the life of one of their chieftains. The story was almost certainly a fabrication. Patent medicine companies loved to claim exotic origins, preferably involving noble savages and ancient wisdom. But the story sold bottles, and the bottles sold themselves. SSS stood for Swift's Southern Specific, later marketed as a blood purifier and cure for syphilis, scrofula, rheumatism, eczema, boils, and a dozen other conditions. The main ingredients were plant extracts, stylingia, poke root, burdock, mixed with enough alcohol to make the patient feel better temporarily. It didn't cure anything, but it made money. By the time Eli married Wylena, the SSS company was generating massive profits. Wylena didn't run the company, but she was the heiress. The money flowed to her, and by extension, to Eli. Almost immediately after their wedding, the couple moved to Eufaula, settling into Eli's modest three-room cottage at 340 North Eufaula Avenue. For a man from a prominent family, married to a woman of considerable wealth, a three-room cottage wasn't going to be enough. Within a year, Eli began planning something grander. Construction began in 1884. The original house was designed by C.A. Stevens, a local Eufaula architect. It was meant to be impressive, but not ostentatious. 2 stories, masonry, respectable, but construction dragged. Eli was particular. He wanted the best materials, the best craftsmen, the best of everything. He had the money for it. Wylena's fortune from SSS Tonic was substantial, and Eli's cotton brokerage brought in steady income. The house slowly took shape. Hand-carved interior details, elaborate moldings, imported marble, but something about the project felt cursed from the start. Maybe it was the foundation. Maybe it was the design. Or maybe it was just bad luck. On May 12, 1895, 11 years after construction began, the house burned to the ground. The Eufaula Daily Times reported the fire 2 days later. The cause was never officially determined. No one died. Eli and Wylena weren't home when it started. By the time the alarm was raised, the fire had already consumed most of the interior. The volunteer fire brigade couldn't save it. Within hours, everything was gone. $5,000 in construction costs vanished. Furnishings, decorations, personal belongings, all ash. For most people, a fire like that would be the end. The cost of rebuilding would be prohibitive. Insurance might cover some of it, but not all. Most families would cut their losses, move into something smaller, accept the setback. But Eli Shorter wasn't most people. He had access to one of the largest patent medicine fortunes in the country. Within weeks, he contracted with T.H. Adams to rebuild on the same site. The new house would be bigger, grander, more expensive. If the first house was ambition, the second would be empire. By late 1895, construction was underway again. This time, there would be no half measures. The house that rose from the ashes between 1895 and 1906 was something else entirely. It wasn't just a home, it was a statement. Eli purchased additional land from his neighbor in 1901, expanding the property. He hired architect C.A. Stevens again for modifications in 1902 and 03. Then, in 1906, he brought in local architect Jack McLeod to oversee $13,000 in final renovations, a staggering sum equivalent to over $400,000 today. The result was a neoclassical revival masterpiece. 8,700 square feet spread across 2 floors. 17 freestanding Corinthian columns lined the front porch, each topped with elaborate capitals carved with acanthus leaves and scrolls. In the center of each flower on the capitals, where a pistil should be, was carved the letter S, Shorter, the family initial, repeated 17 times, impossible to miss. The message was clear. This is ours. We built this. Remember our name. Inside, the craftsmanship bordered on obsessive. The first floor featured hand-cut parquet wooden floors constructed from mahogany, oak, and walnut planks, laid in 3 different intricate patterns: chevron, hexagonal tiling, and interlaced ribbons. The work took 5 years to complete. Every plank was cut and fitted by hand. The craftsmen who did the work were specialists, brought in from Montgomery and Atlanta. Their names weren't recorded. They were hired labor, invisible in the historical record. But their work remains. 6-layer moldings lined the ceilings. Hand-carved wall sculptures adorned the parlors. Inset mirrors hung over fireplaces. The detail was suffocating. Every surface demanded attention. It was the kind of house that made visitors uncomfortable. Too much, too deliberate, too aware of its own grandeur. People started calling it Eli's Folly. Others called it the house that SSS Tonic built. Both nicknames were accurate. The house cost approximately $100,000 to complete, around $3 million in today's money. That figure didn't include the land, the original house that burned, or the ongoing maintenance costs. For context, the average annual income for a skilled worker in 1906 was around $500. A farmhand might make $200. The shorter mansion represented 200 years of labor for a single worker, or the combined lifetime earnings of 500 farmhands, and it was all built on bottles of tonic that didn't work. SSS Tonic wasn't unique. It was one of thousands of patent medicines flooding the American market in the late 19th century. By 1900, the patent medicine industry was worth $80 million annually, over $2.5 billion in today's money. The products were sold everywhere: drugstores, general stores, through mail order, by traveling salesmen. They promised to cure anything: tuberculosis, cancer, infant colic, female complaints, male vitality, baldness, deafness, nervousness, consumption. The truth was simpler and darker. Most patent medicines were combinations of alcohol, opiates, cocaine, or plant extracts with no medicinal value. Alcohol content often ranged from 20 to 50%. Dr. Kilmer's swamp root claimed to cure kidney disease with unspecified swamp roots. Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound for women's health was 19% alcohol. Soothing syrups for fussy babies contained morphine or opium. Mothers dosed their infants to quiet them. Some babies died. Others became addicts before they could walk. The companies knew. They didn't care. Profit was the only metric that mattered. Advertising was shameless. Testimonials were fabricated. Before and after photos were staged. Newspapers ran ads for patent medicines alongside legitimate news because the ad revenue was too lucrative to refuse. Some papers even signed red clause contracts with medicine companies, agreeing that if the paper published anything critical of patent medicines, all advertising would be pulled immediately. It was a protection racket dressed up as commerce. SSS Tonic was marketed as a blood purifier. The advertising claimed it cured syphilis, scrofula, rheumatism, eczema, boils, and general blood impurity. The main ingredients were Stillingia root, poke root, and burdock, mixed with alcohol. None of these plants cure syphilis. Syphilis is a bacterial infection that requires antibiotic treatment. In the late 19th century, before antibiotics, syphilis was incurable. People who bought SSS Tonic thinking it would cure them were wasting their money at best. At worst, they were delaying real treatment, allowing the disease to progress into its later stages: dementia, paralysis, death. The company knew this. They sold it anyway. The profits from those bottles paid for the marble in Eli Shorter's house. The craftsmen who carved the S into those Corinthian columns were paid with money taken from desperate people who believed a lie. And Eli lived in that house, walked those parquet floors, entertained guests in those parlors, and never once, as far as the record shows, questioned where the money came from. But something was shifting in America. Public anger over patent medicines had been building for years. In 1905, journalist Samuel Hopkins Adams published a series of articles in Collier's magazine titled The Great American Fraud, exposing the industry's lies. He detailed the alcohol content, the opiate addiction, the false claims, the babies who died from soothing syrups. The articles were explosive. Other journalists followed. Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle, published in 1906, revealed horrific conditions in Chicago's meatpacking plants. The public was outraged. Congress was forced to act. On June 30th, 1906, the same year Eli Shorter completed the final renovations on his mansion, President Theodore Roosevelt signed the Pure Food and Drug Act into law. The act required accurate labeling of food and drug contents. It prohibited interstate commerce in adulterated or misbranded products. For the first time, patent medicine companies had to list their ingredients. If your tonic contained alcohol, cocaine, morphine, or other narcotics, you had to say so on the label. The law didn't ban these ingredients outright. It just required honesty. And honesty was devastating. Once consumers knew what was actually in the bottles, sales plummeted. SSS Tonic continued to operate. It still exists today as SSS Company, though the formula has changed dramatically. But the golden age of patent medicines was over. The era of unregulated medical fraud, when a man could make a fortune selling lies in bottles, was ending. The timing was almost poetic. The same year Eli Shorter completed his monument to tonic bottle wealth, the government pulled the rug out from under the entire industry. The house was finished. The money was already spent. But the source of that money was drying up. And Eli Shorter had 2 years left to live. Eli Sims Shorter II died in 1908 at the age of 49. The cause of death wasn't widely reported. He was buried in Fairview Cemetery in Eufaula, alongside his father and uncle and the rest of the Shorter dynasty. He left behind Wilena and their children. The mansion was hers now. She stayed. For 19 years, Wilena Lamar Shorter lived alone in that enormous house. 8,700 square feet, 17 columns, hand-carved everything, rooms that echoed. She didn't remarry. She didn't leave. The house had staff, of course, maids, cooks, groundskeepers. Black workers mostly paid low wages to maintain a monument to white wealth built on the suffering of desperate sick people. Wilena lived there through World War I, through the 1920s boom, through the early murmurs of the Depression. She died in 1927, 19 years after Eli. She was 66. The house passed to their daughter, Fanny Shorter Upshaw. Fanny lived there for a time, but eventually she too moved on. The house passed again to Fanny's daughter, Wilena S. Kennedy, named after her grandmother. By the 1960s, the Kennedy family no longer lived in Eufaula. The mansion sat largely empty, a relic of another era. Maintaining it was expensive. Property taxes, repairs, utilities, it all added up. The house was too big, too ornate, too expensive for a modern family. And by 1965, Wilena S. Kennedy had had enough. In August of that year, the Eufaula Tribune announced that the Shorter Upshaw mansion and its furnishings would be sold at auction. The news sent a ripple through the town. This was the Shorter mansion, the house that SSS Tonic built. The house with 17 columns and an S on every capital. It couldn't just disappear, could it? Eufaula Mayor Hamp Graves appointed a committee to investigate purchasing the mansion as a city civic center. The committee moved quickly. They organized. They raised pledges from local citizens, and on auction day, they placed the winning bid, $33,000. For a house that cost $100,000 to build, that represented a 97% loss over 59 years. Adjusted for inflation, the mansion sold for less than 1/10 of its construction cost. The Eufaula Heritage Association was formed specifically to purchase and preserve the mansion. It became their headquarters. The first Eufaula pilgrimage, an annual tour of historic homes, was held in April 1966. The mansion was the centerpiece. Today, it remains open to the public, a museum honoring Alabama governors, local history, and the grandeur of the Old South. Let's talk numbers, because numbers tell the truth when narratives don't. The Shorter Mansion, 8,700 square feet, 17 Corinthian columns, 3 types of parquet flooring patterns. Hand-cut mahogany, oak, and walnut planks, 6-layer moldings throughout. Construction time, 5 years for the floors alone. Total construction cost, approximately $100,000 in 1906, equivalent to roughly $3 million today. $13,000 spent on the 1906 renovations alone, $400,000 in modern currency just for upgrades. The property was sold at auction in 1965 for $33,000, roughly $300,000 today, a loss of 90%. The patent medicine industry that paid for all of this, $80 million annually by 1900, over $2,500 million in today's money. SSS Tonic was one of the top sellers, with distribution from Atlanta to New York. The average bottle cost $1 in the 1880s, equivalent to $30 today. Most families bought multiple bottles. Desperate people, sick people, people with no other options, spending the equivalent of $60, $90, $120 on bottles of alcohol and plant extracts that did nothing. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 required labeling of narcotics in medicines. Opiate sales in patent medicines dropped by 33% after labeling requirements took effect. 33% of the market had been built on consumers not knowing they were buying drugs. After Eli's death, Wilena lived in the mansion for 19 years. 19 years alone in 8,700 square feet. Multiply that by 365 days. 6,935 days in a house built on lies, walking over floors paid for by suffering. The house required a full-time staff to maintain. Maids, cooks, groundskeepers, at least 6 to 10 people working constantly to keep it clean, functional, presentable. Most were paid between $5 and $15 a week in the 1920s, roughly $100 to $300 weekly in today's terms. The house consumed their labor like it consumed everything else. In 1972, 7 years after the Eufaula Heritage Association purchased it, the Shorter Mansion was added to the National Register of Historic Places. It stands today in the Seth Lore and Irwinton Historic District, one of over 700 structures in Eufaula listed on the register, the second largest historic district in Alabama. The house draws over 10,000 visitors annually. Admission is $10 per adult. That's $100,000 in annual ticket revenue, or roughly $3 million over 30 years. It took 3 decades of museum operation just to equal the original construction cost, not adjusted for inflation. And every visitor who walks through those doors sees the craftsmanship, the columns, the parquet floors. Most never ask, who paid for this and what did it cost them? But here's what the numbers don't tell you. They don't tell you what it felt like to buy a bottle of SSS tonic in 1890, believing it would cure your child's scrofula and watch your child die anyway. They don't tell you what it felt like to scrub those parquet floors every day, a black maid in the 1920s earning pennies to maintain a white woman's monument. They don't tell you what it felt like to be Eli Shorter, walking through his house in 1907, knowing the law had just changed, knowing his fortune was built on fraud, knowing he had 1 year left to live. Or maybe he didn't know. Maybe he believed his own story. Maybe he convinced himself the money was legitimate, that his family's legacy was clean, that the house was a testament to hard work and smart investments. People are good at that, convincing themselves. It's easier than facing the truth. Eli came from a family of lawyers and governors. He married into medicine money. He built a house with columns and carvings and floors that took 5 years to finish. He died in that house. His wife lived there alone for 19 years. The house passed to his daughter, then his granddaughter, then to strangers who turned it into a museum, and now tourists walk through it, taking pictures, admiring the architecture, marveling at the details. The tour guides don't talk much about SSS tonic. They mention it in passing. The family made their fortune in patent medicines, but they don't dwell on it. They don't explain what patent medicines were, or what they did, or who suffered because of them. The focus is on the architecture, the craftsmanship, the historical significance. The house is beautiful. No one disputes that. The columns are stunning. The floors are works of art. The detail is extraordinary. But beauty doesn't erase cost, and cost isn't always measured in dollars. Think about the arithmetic of exploitation. A bottle of SSS tonic sold for approximately $1 in the 1880s. The ingredients, Stillingia root, poke root, burdock, alcohol, cost perhaps 10 to 15 cents to procure and bottle. That's a profit margin of 85 to 90%. Now multiply that by production volume. The SSS Tonic Company was one of the largest patent medicine operations in the South. Conservative estimates suggest they sold tens of thousands of bottles annually, possibly hundreds of thousands at their peak. Let's be modest and say 50,000 bottles per year at their height. That's $50,000 in annual revenue, with costs around $7,500. $42,500 in profit year after year. Over a decade, that's $425,000. Over 2 decades, $850,000. These are rough numbers, but they illustrate the scale. This wasn't a small operation. This was industrial-scale fraud. And it worked because the regulatory framework didn't exist. There was no FDA, no truth in advertising laws, no consumer protection. If you could convince people your product worked, you could sell it. If it didn't work, that was their problem, not yours. The genius of patent medicine marketing was that it targeted the desperate, people with chronic illnesses, with conditions that doctors couldn't cure, with pain that wouldn't stop. These were people who'd tried everything else. They were willing to believe anything, and the companies knew this. The testimonials in advertisements weren't from satisfied customers. They were fabricated. The before and after photographs were staged with different people. The medical endorsements were bought or invented. Every aspect of the marketing was designed to exploit hope, and it worked spectacularly well. So when you walk through the Shorter mansion and admire the craftsmanship, remember, every board in those floors represents dozens, maybe hundreds of people who bought bottles that didn't work. Every column represents thousands of dollars extracted from people who couldn't afford to lose it. Every piece of marble, every carved sculpture, every bit of elaborate molding, it all came from that same source. The house is a physical manifestation of accumulated suffering, transformed into beauty through money. That transformation is what we call wealth, and wealth in polite society erases questions about origin. Let's talk about the fire. May 12, 1895. The original house, 11 years in construction, burns to the ground. The official cause was never determined. No investigation report survives if one was ever written. House fires were common in the 19th century. Candles, kerosene lamps, coal stoves, wooden construction. It's entirely possible it was an accident. Electrical fires weren't a concern yet. The house likely wasn't wired for electricity until much later. But here's what's strange: the timing. 1895 was a year of significant labor unrest in the South. The Panic of 1893 had triggered a severe economic depression. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Unemployment soared. In the cotton regions, prices collapsed. Tenant farmers and sharecroppers, many of them black, were barely surviving. Meanwhile, the wealthy, people like Eli Shorter, remained largely insulated. Their money was diversified, their investments protected. The house on North Eufaula Avenue stood as a monument to that insulation, a constant reminder of inequality. There's no evidence of arson. None. But the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. And in a town with deep economic disparities, in a region still reeling from Reconstruction and the birth of Jim Crow, fires had a way of happening to the property of the wealthy. Sometimes they were accidents. Sometimes they weren't. Sometimes they were messages. Was the Shorter House fire a message? We can't know. But what we can know is this: when the house burned, Eli didn't hesitate. He didn't move somewhere smaller. He didn't take it as a sign. He immediately began planning a bigger, grander house on the same spot. If the fire was meant to humble him, it failed. If it was meant to be a warning, he ignored it. Or maybe the fire was just an accident, a tragedy, a setback that a wealthy man could overcome because he had the resources to do so. Maybe there's no deeper meaning. Maybe sometimes houses just burn. The craftsmen who built the second house came from Montgomery and Atlanta, according to historical records. They were specialists, men who knew how to work with rare woods, how to create intricate parquet patterns, how to carve moldings that wouldn't crack or warp with humidity and temperature changes. These were skilled workers, the kind of men who could find employment anywhere. They chose to work on the Shorter House because the pay was good and the project was prestigious. Building a house for a wealthy family meant job security for months, maybe years. It meant regular wages, meals provided on site, sometimes even accommodation if you came from out of town. It was good work by the standards of the time, but nobody asked what the work was building or where the money came from. You didn't ask. You took the job, you did the work, you collected your pay, you moved on to the next project. That's how labor works. You sell your time and skill to whoever's buying. The moral economy of your employer's wealth isn't your concern, except sometimes it is. Sometimes the houses we build with our hands become monuments to things we wouldn't choose to celebrate. Sometimes our labor enables something we'd oppose if we thought about it too hard. The craftsmen who laid those floors, who carved those moldings, who erected those columns, they weren't complicit in patent medicine fraud. They were just workers doing a job. But their work made the fraud visible, permanent, beautiful. Their skill transformed stolen money into stolen grandeur. And now their work outlives them, their names forgotten, their contribution reduced to skilled craftsmen in historical descriptions. The house remembers their hands, but not their faces. The floors remember their precision, but not their names. The columns remember their labor, but not their lives. This is what it means to be working class in America. You build monuments to other people's wealth, and history forgets you were even there. Wilena Lamar Shorter wasn't just a passive heiress. The historical record doesn't give us much about her personality, her beliefs, her inner life, but we know some things. She was educated from a wealthy Georgia family. Her father, Colonel Henry J. Lamar, was a prominent figure in Macon. Her mother, Valeria Bathsheba Jones Lamar, inherited the SSS. Tonic fortune. Wilena grew up with money, married into more money, and lived her entire adult life in material comfort. She had children, at least one daughter, Fanny, who inherited the house. She survived Eli by 19 years, living alone in that enormous mansion with only staff for company. What did she do with all that time? What did she think about? The historical record doesn't say. We have no letters, no diaries, no interviews. What we have is the house and the fact that she stayed. She could have left. She could have sold the mansion after Eli died, moved somewhere smaller, somewhere more manageable. She could have relocated to Macon, where her family was. She could have traveled. She had the money. She had the freedom. But she stayed. For 19 years, she stayed. Maybe the house was a prison. Maybe it was a refuge. Maybe it was both. Maybe she couldn't leave because leaving would mean acknowledging that the house was wrong, that the money was wrong, that her entire life had been built on something rotten. Or maybe she just loved the house. Maybe she loved the parquet floors and the elaborate moldings and the 17 columns. Maybe she looked at those S capitals and felt pride. Maybe she walked those halls at night and felt her husband's presence. Maybe the house was the one place where she felt close to him, where she could remember what their life had been before the law changed, before the industry collapsed, before he died and left her alone with all that beauty and all that silence. We'll never know. Wilena Shorter died in 1927, and whatever she thought, whatever she felt, she took it with her. What remains is the house and the fact that she couldn't leave it. The Great Depression hit Alabama hard. By 1930, the state's economy was in freefall. Cotton prices, which had been declining since the end of World War I, collapsed completely. Banks closed, farms foreclosed. Unemployment in some counties reached 50%. Eufaula, like most southern towns, suffered. The population declined. Businesses shuttered. The grand houses along Eufaula Avenue, built in the cotton boom years, became harder to maintain. Many were subdivided into apartments. Some fell into disrepair. A few burned or were demolished. But the Shorter mansion survived. By then it belonged to Fanny Shorter Upshaw, Eli and Wilena's daughter. She had resources, though probably not as much as her grandparents had enjoyed. The tonic money was largely gone, diluted through inheritance and time and changing regulations. But the house remained, a physical asset that could be maintained if you had enough capital. Fanny kept it standing through the Depression, through World War II, through the post-war years. But by the late 1950s, even Fanny had had enough. The house passed to her daughter, Wilena S. Kennedy, who inherited a problem. A beautiful, enormous, historically significant house that cost a fortune to maintain and served no practical purpose for a modern family. By 1965, the Kennedy family had moved away from Eufaula. The house sat largely empty. Property taxes were due, maintenance was deferred, the house was becoming a liability, and in 1965, Wilena S. Kennedy made a decision: sell it. The announcement in the Eufaula Tribune shocked the town. The Shorter mansion, the house that SSS Tonic built, the house with 17 columns and an S on every capital, was going up for auction. Everything inside, the furnishings, the antiques, the family memorabilia, would be sold to the highest bidder. The house would likely be demolished or converted into apartments. Eufaula's most iconic building was about to disappear, but something unexpected happened. The community mobilized. Mayor Hamp Graves appointed a committee, Joel P. Smith Sr. as chairman, along with Florence Foystrang, Ben Reeves, Willard Smith, Wade Perry, Neil Logue, Donald Comer III, and Bill Roberts. Their goal was simple: save the house. They moved quickly. They solicited pledges from local citizens, business owners, anyone who cared about Eufaula's history. They organized a preservation effort before preservation was fashionable. This was 1965. The modern historic preservation movement was just beginning. The National Historic Preservation Act wouldn't be passed until 1966. Most American cities were still demolishing old buildings to make way for parking lots and modernist architecture. But Eufaula was different. The town had over 700 historic structures. It had a unique architectural heritage, a collection of antebellum homes that told the story of Southern wealth and culture. Losing the Shorter Mansion would be losing a piece of that story, so the community acted. On auction day, the committee arrived with pledges totaling $33,000. When the bidding started, they bid, and when the hammer fell, they'd won. The Eufaula Heritage Association was born in that moment, formed specifically to purchase and preserve the Shorter Mansion. It was a spontaneous act of civic pride, a recognition that some things are worth saving even when you're not entirely sure why. The house became the association's headquarters. A state grant of $75,000 was awarded to honor Alabama governors from Barber County. The money was used to purchase antique furnishings and restore the house as a museum. Plans were made for an annual pilgrimage, a tour of historic homes that would offset maintenance costs and promote preservation efforts. The first Eufaula pilgrimage was held in April 1966. It's still held every year, on the first weekend in April. The Shorter Mansion is the centerpiece. Thousands of visitors walk through those doors annually, admiring the architecture, learning the history, taking their pictures on that columned porch. The house survived because the community decided it should survive. And that decision, to save, to preserve, to honor, tells you something about Eufaula's values, about what the town chooses to remember and what it chooses to forget. Here's the uncomfortable part. Preservation is a choice, and every choice reveals priorities. When Eufaula chose to save the Shorter Mansion, it chose to honor a particular version of history, the version where the house is a testament to craftsmanship, family legacy, and architectural beauty. It didn't choose to honor the version where the house is a monument to patent medicine fraud, built on the desperation of sick people who had no other options. Both versions are true, but only one gets emphasized on the museum tours. This isn't unique to Eufaula. Every historic preservation effort faces this dilemma. Do you tell the whole story, including the ugly parts? Or do you focus on the beautiful parts and let visitors imagine the rest? Most places choose beauty. It's easier. It's more marketable. People don't want to spend $10 to feel guilty. They want to admire beautiful architecture and learn interesting facts and feel connected to history without confronting the moral complexity of that history. The Shorter Mansion tour does mention SS tonic. The guides say, the family made their fortune in patent medicines, and then they move on to talk about the parquet floors. They don't explain what patent medicines were, or why they were profitable, or who suffered because of them. They don't talk about the Pure Food and Drug Act or why it became necessary. They don't mention the fraud, the false advertising, the babies who died from opiate-laced soothing syrups. They focus on the positive, the craftsmanship, the family's prominence, the house's survival, and most visitors leave satisfied. They learned something. They saw something beautiful. They took their pictures. That's enough. But what about the people who bought the tonic? What about the workers who built the house? What about the staff who maintained it? What about the context, the system, the economy that made the house possible? Those stories aren't told. Not because they're hidden, but because they're uncomfortable. And uncomfortable stories don't fit neatly into a one-hour museum tour, so they're elided, softened, reduced to single sentences that acknowledge without examining. The house is preserved, the story is sanitized, the beauty remains, the cost is forgotten. There's a photograph from 1920, 5 years after Eli's death, that shows Wilena standing on the front porch of the mansion. She's in her late 50s, dressed in black, her face composed but unreadable. Behind her, the 17 columns rise toward the roof, the S capitals clearly visible even in the photograph's grain. The house looks imposing, solid, permanent. Wilena looks small. She's standing at the center of the porch, but she doesn't fill the space. The house dwarfs her. You can't tell from the photograph what she's thinking. Her expression reveals nothing. But the composition tells a story. A woman alone in a monument too large for one person, standing in the shadow of columns that spell out a name that isn't even hers. She was born Lamar. She married Shorter. The S on those columns is her husband's initial, her adopted name, her identity subsumed into his. And after his death, she remained in that house for 19 years, living under that name, in that shadow, maintaining a monument to a fortune she inherited but didn't create, built by an industry she didn't run but benefited from. What does it feel like to live like that? To walk through rooms paid for by suffering you didn't cause but profited from? To know that your comfort depends on a system of exploitation you can't change but can't escape? The photograph doesn't tell you. Welena's face doesn't tell you. The house doesn't tell you. But somewhere in that silence, in the space between the woman and the columns, is the truth about American wealth. It's inherited, it's structural, it separates you from its origins, and it becomes your identity whether you chose it or not. Welena didn't create SSS tonic. She didn't write the advertisements or sell the bottles. But she lived in the house the tonic built, and when she died, that house became her legacy. The photograph remains, an image of a woman standing alone in front of 17 columns that spell out someone else's name, in a house built on someone else's suffering, living a life defined by wealth she didn't earn but couldn't refuse. And if you look closely at that photograph, at Welena's face, at her posture, at the way she stands apart from the columns rather than among them, you might see what the museum tour doesn't emphasize, the possibility that she knew exactly what that house was and stayed anyway, because leaving would mean admitting that everything her life was built on was wrong, and some truths are too heavy to carry. The architecture tells its own story. Neoclassical revival was a popular style in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly in the South. It evoked ancient Greece and Rome, suggesting civilization, order, democracy, permanence. The columns, the symmetry, the elaborate capitals, these were deliberate choices meant to connect the house to a grand historical tradition. But there's a paradox here. The style evokes Greek democracy, but the wealth that paid for it came from a profoundly undemocratic system, one where companies could lie to desperate people without consequence, where regulatory frameworks didn't exist, where profit mattered more than truth. The columns say, we are civilized, educated, connected to great traditions. The money that built them says, we exploited the vulnerable and got away with it. Both things are true simultaneously. The house is both a work of art and a crime scene, and this is why preservation is complicated. We preserve the columns because they're beautiful, because they demonstrate exceptional craftsmanship, because they are historically significant. But in preserving them, we're also preserving a monument to fraud. We can't separate the two. The beauty and the crime are literally built into the same structure. Every board in those parquet floors, every piece of marble, every carved scroll on those capitals, it all came from bottles of useless tonic sold to desperate people. You can't admire the craftsmanship without confronting that fact. Or you can, if you choose not to think about it. Most people choose not to think about it. The museum tour makes that choice easy. It focuses your attention on the positive aspects. Look at this beautiful floor. See how intricate the pattern is. Notice the 3 different types of wood. It doesn't say, this floor cost $5,000, which represented 10 years of wages for a factory worker, and it was paid for by selling false hope to sick people. Both facts are true, but only one is emphasized. And in that emphasis, in that choice of what to highlight and what to downplay, the house becomes something other than what it is. It becomes a monument to craftsmanship rather than a monument to fraud. It becomes a celebration of beauty rather than a reminder of cost. And the transformation happens so smoothly, so naturally, that most visitors never notice. They see what they're shown. They admire what they're told to admire. They leave satisfied, having learned something about architecture and family history and Southern culture. They don't leave thinking about the people who bought the tonic, or the workers who built the house, or the moral complexity of preserving a monument built on suffering. And maybe that's fine. Maybe we can hold multiple truths at once. Maybe we can admire the craftsmanship while acknowledging the cost. Maybe preservation doesn't require endorsement. Or maybe we're just really good at looking at beautiful things and not asking where they came from. There's a question that keeps surfacing, no matter how many facts you stack on top of it. Did Eli Shorter know? Did he understand what SSS tonic really was? He didn't manufacture it. He didn't create the formula. He didn't write the advertising. He married into the fortune. His wife was the heiress. He was a cotton broker by trade. Maybe he thought of the tonic money as separate, as something that existed in a different category, something he didn't have to examine too closely. Or maybe he knew exactly what it was and didn't care. Maybe the moral calculus was simple. This is how business works. Everyone's doing it. The money's legal. Why shouldn't we spend it? The problem is, we'll never know. Eli Shorter left no diary, no memoir, no letters discussing his feelings about patent medicine fraud. What we have is the house. And the house says, I wanted to be remembered. I wanted to build something that would last, something that would bear my name, something that would prove I mattered. The S on those 17-column capitals wasn't an accident. It wasn't decorative whimsy. It was deliberate. Shorter. Remember that name. We were here. We built this. We were important. But importance and morality aren't the same thing. And sometimes the things we build to be remembered become monuments to what we'd rather forget. Consider the economics of 19th century labor. The craftsmen who built the Shorter mansion were paid well by the standards of their time, perhaps $3 to $5 a day for skilled work, which was significantly above average. A laborer might make $1 a day, a farmhand 50 cents. So the craftsmen were privileged workers, relatively speaking. But here's the context. Those wages were paid with money extracted from people who couldn't afford to lose it. A bottle of SSS. Tonic cost $1. For a laborer earning $1 a day, that was a full day's wages. For a farmhand, 2 days. If you bought 6 bottles, a recommended treatment course according to some advertisements, that was 6 days of labor for a worker, 12 days for a farmhand. And the tonic didn't work, so you bought more bottles, chasing a cure that didn't exist, spending money you didn't have, falling further behind. Meanwhile, the money from your bottles flowed to Macon, to Atlanta, to the SS Tonic Company, and eventually to Wilena Lamar's inheritance, and then to Eli Shorter's construction budget. Your desperation became his marble mantle. Your false hope became his parquet floor. Your suffering became his monument. The craftsmen who did the actual building were intermediaries in this transfer. They sold their labor for wages, and the wages came from tonic profits, and the tonic profits came from lies told to sick people. The craftsmen weren't morally responsible for the lies, but their skill made the lies permanent, visible, beautiful. This is how economic systems work. They distribute moral responsibility so thoroughly that nobody feels individually culpable. The company sells the tonic, the heir inherits the wealth, the husband spends it, the craftsmen build with it, the house stands. And at the end of the chain, the sick person who bought the tonic is dead or broke or both, and nobody who profited feels responsible because everybody was just doing their job, just following the market, just participating in the economy. The system works precisely because it diffuses responsibility. And the house, the beautiful, elaborate, carefully crafted house, is the physical manifestation of that diffusion. It's a monument to a system where everyone benefits except the people at the bottom, and everyone at the top can claim they weren't personally to blame. Eufaula in the 1920s was a town in transition. The cotton economy was fading. The river trade was gone. Railroads had taken over. The population was declining slowly but steadily. The grand antebellum houses that lined the avenues were becoming expensive to maintain. Some families held on, living in reduced circumstances in houses built for larger households and larger fortunes. Others sold, subdivided, moved away. Wilena Shorter stayed. She was one of the last of her kind, a wealthy widow living alone in a mansion built before the world changed. The house required constant maintenance, leaking roofs, cracked plaster, rotting wood, paint that peeled in the humid Alabama summers. And that was just the exterior. Inside, the parquet floors needed periodic refinishing. The marble needed cleaning. The elaborate moldings collected dust. The mirrors tarnished. Everything required attention, care, money. Wilena had the money, but money alone isn't enough. You need staff. You need people willing to do the work. And in the 1920s South, that meant black workers, the descendants of enslaved people, now working for wages that barely allowed them to survive. The economic structure had changed, but the underlying reality hadn't. White families with money employed black workers for low pay to maintain their comfort. The workers needed the jobs. The employers needed the workers. It was a mutually dependent system built on profound inequality. Welena wasn't unusual in this. Every wealthy white family in Eufaula employed black staff. It was expected, normal, the way things worked. But that doesn't make it less exploitative. The staff who maintained the shorter mansion weren't volunteers. They were economic captives, working because the alternatives were worse. And their labor, daily, ongoing, invisible, is what kept the house beautiful, kept the floors shining, kept the columns clean, kept the monument standing. Without them, the house would have deteriorated. Within a decade, it would have been uninhabitable. Within 2 decades, it would have been a ruin. But they kept it alive. And history doesn't record their names. There's a specific kind of silence that surrounds wealth, a refusal to interrogate origins. We see this in the shorter mansion tours, but we see it everywhere. When you walk through any historic house museum, Biltmore, Hearst Castle, the Newport mansions, the focus is always on the architecture, the art, the furnishings, the lifestyle of the wealthy. The tour guides talk about the family's prominence, their contributions to society, their refined taste. They mention the staff in passing. The house required 30 servants. The kitchen employed 15 cooks. But they don't dwell on it. They don't talk about wages, working conditions, hours, or what it felt like to spend your life maintaining someone else's grandeur. They don't talk about where the money came from. They don't interrogate the source of the wealth. And if they do mention it, the family fortune came from railroads. The family fortune came from steel. The family fortune came from patent medicines. They move on quickly. The focus returns to beauty, to craftsmanship, to the lifestyle of the wealthy. This isn't an accident. It's a deliberate choice, embedded in how we tell stories about wealth in America. We celebrate the result, the beautiful house, the impressive collection, the refined taste, without examining the process that made it possible. We admire the mansion without counting the cost. We marvel at the craftsmanship without asking who paid for it. We preserve the monument without confronting what it represents. And this selective memory, this careful curation of history, allows us to enjoy the beauty without feeling guilty. It allows us to walk through houses built on exploitation and leave feeling inspired rather than troubled. It allows us to take our pictures in front of 17 columns and never once think about the bottles of useless tonic that paid for them. The shorter mansion isn't unique in this. It's typical. Every historic house museum in America grapples with this same problem. How do you tell the truth about wealth without making visitors uncomfortable? How do you preserve the beauty without endorsing the system that created it? How do you honor craftsmanship without celebrating exploitation? Most museums choose comfort over truth. They tell the parts of the story that are easy to hear and leave out the parts that aren't. And visitors leave satisfied, having seen something beautiful, learned something interesting, without ever confronting the moral complexity of what they've just admired. The shorter mansion is that pattern, crystallized into 17 columns and 8,700 square feet. After Eli's death, the house became Wylena's burden, or maybe it was her refuge. The historical record doesn't give us much insight into her inner life. We know she stayed. We know she didn't remarry. We know she lived there from 1908 until 1927, through World War I, through the Spanish flu pandemic, through the Roaring Twenties. Eufaula was changing. The cotton economy was fading. Railroads had replaced river traffic. The town was smaller, quieter, less important than it had been in the antebellum era. But the house remained. Did Welena walk those halls at night and think about where the money came from? Did she ever consider the people who bought the tonic, who believed the promises, who spent money they didn't have on a cure that didn't work? Or did she, like Eli, compartmentalize? The tonic company was in Macon, in Atlanta. It was far away. It was business. This house was home. It's easy to separate the two when you never have to see the faces of the people you're hurting. The staff kept the house running. They cleaned, cooked, gardened, maintained. Most were black workers, descendants of enslaved people who'd worked the plantations that built Eufaula's first fortunes. Now they worked for low wages in the homes of white families who'd rebuilt their wealth after the war. The house required constant labor, dusting those moldings, polishing those floors, maintaining those 17 columns, It was a full-time job for multiple people, and at the end of the week they went home to houses that didn't have parquet floors or marble mantels. They went home to houses that might not have running water or electricity. They went home and they came back because they needed the work, because there weren't many options, because this was how the economy functioned. And Welina lived in the center of all that labor, in the house that required it, in the silence that came from never asking where the money came from or who paid the real price. By the time the house was sold at auction in 1965, it had been standing for 59 years. 2 generations of Shorters had lived there, died there, passed it on. The house had survived the death of the patent medicine industry, the Great Depression, 2 world wars, massive social change. It had survived because it was built well, because someone always maintained it, because the community valued it enough to preserve it. But survival isn't the same as justification. The house survived, but that doesn't mean it should have been built in the first place. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, but that doesn't erase the cost. The preservation is admirable, but that doesn't mean we should celebrate what's being preserved. These are difficult truths to hold simultaneously. We want stories to be simple, good or bad, right or wrong, worth saving or worth forgetting. But the Shorter mansion is none of those things. It's complicated. It's beautiful and terrible. It's a work of art and a crime scene. It's a testament to human skill and a monument to human exploitation. It's all of these things at once, and we can't separate them no matter how carefully we curate the story. The house is what it is. The only question is whether we're willing to see it clearly or whether we'll keep telling the comfortable version, the one that focuses on beauty and forgets about cost. Most people, given the choice, will choose comfort. The museum tour is designed around that choice. It gives you permission to admire the house without confronting what it represents. It lets you take your pictures and leave satisfied without ever asking the difficult questions. And maybe that's fine. Maybe we can't expect every museum tour to be a moral reckoning. Maybe the house can be both a tourist attraction and a troubling monument. Maybe we can preserve it without endorsing it. Or maybe that's just another comfortable lie we tell ourselves, so we don't have to face the truth, that we live in a country that builds monuments to exploitation and calls them heritage, that we preserve the beautiful parts and erase the ugly parts, and that we do this so smoothly, so naturally, that most people never notice what's been left out. The patent medicine industry as a whole is a fascinating case study in unregulated capitalism. Before the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, there were no requirements for truth in advertising, no standards for drug purity, no protections for consumers. If you could convince people to buy your product, you could sell it. If it didn't work, that was their problem. If it was addictive, that was even better for repeat sales. If it killed people, well, nobody was really tracking that. The companies operated in a legal vacuum. They weren't breaking any laws because there were no laws to break. And they made enormous profits. By 1900, the patent medicine industry was worth $80 million annually, more than $2.5 billion in today's money. That's larger than some entire state economies. Thousands of companies, tens of thousands of products, millions of bottles sold every year. And most of them were useless at best, dangerous at worst. The industry was built on a simple insight. Desperate people will try anything. If you're sick and doctors can't help you, if you're in pain and nothing works, if you're watching someone you love suffer and there's nothing you can do, you'll buy a bottle that promises relief. You'll believe the testimonials. You'll trust the advertisements. You'll spend money you can't afford, because what else can you do? Hope is a powerful motivator, and the patent medicine industry commodified hope. They bottled it, branded it, sold it for $1. And when it didn't work, when the patient stayed sick or got worse or died, the companies just sold more bottles. Because maybe you didn't take enough. Maybe you didn't follow the directions. Maybe you need the stronger formula. There's always another product to sell, another claim to make, another dollar to extract. S Tonic was just one of thousands. It wasn't particularly worse than the others. The claims were typical: blood purifier, cure for syphilis and scrofula and rheumatism. The ingredients were typical: plant extracts and alcohol. The marketing was typical: testimonials, endorsements, exotic origin stories. It was a thoroughly average patent medicine, which is to say it was completely fraudulent and highly profitable, and the profits built the Shorter mansion. Every column, every floor, every piece of marble, paid for by desperate people who believed a lie. This is the system. This is how it worked, and the house stands as a monument not just to one family's wealth, but to an entire economic structure that rewarded exploitation and punished honesty. The Pure Food and Drug Act changed the rules. It required truth. And truth destroyed the industry, because once people knew what was actually in the bottles, they stopped buying. The golden age of patent medicines ended not because companies developed a conscience, but because the government forced transparency. And once the lies were exposed, the business model collapsed. But the houses remained. The mansions built on tonic profits, the fortunes accumulated through fraud, the wealth transferred to heirs and invested and multiplied, all of that remained. The system distributed the profits widely enough that individual culpability was diffused. Nobody felt personally responsible, everybody just participated. And at the end, the sick people were still sick, the desperate were still desperate, and the wealthy still had their mansions. There's a particular cruelty in the timing. Eli Shorter completed the final renovations on his mansion in 1906. The Pure Food and Drug Act was signed into law on June 30th, 1906. The house was finished, the money was spent, and then immediately the source of that money began to dry up. It's almost poetic. The monument was completed just as the foundation began to crumble. Eli had 2 years to live in his finished palace before he died in 1908. Did he understand what was happening? Did he see the industry changing, the regulations tightening, the profits declining? Or did he die believing his fortune was secure, his legacy established, his house permanent? We don't know. But here's what we do know. The house outlasted the fortune that built it. By the time it was sold in 1965, the tonic money was long gone, diluted through 3 generations, spent on living expenses and maintenance and taxes. The house itself had become a burden, too expensive to maintain, too significant to demolish. And it was sold for $33,000, a 90% loss from its construction cost. In a way, that sale price is the most honest valuation the house ever received. Not what it cost to build, but what it was worth to someone else. And the answer was, not much. Beautiful, yes. Historically significant, yes, but also impractical, expensive, burdened by history, tainted by association with fraud. Worth saving, but only barely. Worth $33,000, but not a penny more. The community saved it because letting it disappear would have been a loss, but saving it didn't mean celebrating it. Saving it meant acknowledging that it existed, that it was part of Eufaula's story, and that erasing it wouldn't change the history it represented. The house stands now as a kind of monument to preservation itself, proof that we can save things without endorsing what they represent, that we can maintain beauty without celebrating its origins, that we can tell complicated stories if we're willing to confront complexity rather than choosing comfort. But that's only true if we actually tell the complicated story, if we talk about the tonic fraud and the desperate people who bought it, if we talk about the craftsmen whose names we don't know, and the staff whose labor kept the house alive, if we talk about the economic systems that made the house possible and the moral compromises those systems required. If we tell the whole truth, the house becomes something different, not a monument to one family's success, but a monument to an entire system of exploitation, preserved so we can learn from it rather than repeat it. But if we don't tell that story, if we focus on the beauty and skip the cost, if we emphasize the craftsmanship and downplay the fraud, if we celebrate the preservation without confronting what's being preserved, then we're not learning anything. We're just admiring pretty columns and calling it history. When Welena died in 1927, the house passed to Fanny Shorter Upshaw, Eli and Welena's daughter. Fanny had grown up in that house, walked those floors, played in those rooms. For her, it wasn't a monument to tonic profits. It was home. It was where her parents lived, where her memories were. But Fanny didn't stay. She eventually moved away, though the exact timeline isn't clear. The house passed to her daughter, Welena S. Kennedy, sometime around 1959. By then, the mansion was an anachronism. The world had moved on. Houses like this, massive, ornate, labor-intensive, were relics of an earlier era. They required enormous resources to maintain. Property taxes alone were substantial. Repairs were constant. Utilities for 8,700 square feet added up. And for what? To live in a house built by your great-grandfather with money from a fraudulent medicine company? to walk floors laid by anonymous craftsmen who were never remembered, to maintain a legacy that, examined closely, revealed more about American greed than American greatness? By 1965, the Kennedy family had left Eufaula. They no longer wanted the house, and honestly, who could blame them? It was too big, too expensive, too heavy with unspoken history, so they put it up for auction. The irony is almost too perfect. A house built on selling false hope to desperate people, sold at auction for a fraction of its cost, rescued by a community that wanted to preserve its grandeur without really interrogating its origins. The Eufaula Heritage Association bought it, restored it, turned it into a museum and event venue. Today, you can rent the Shorter Mansion for weddings, receptions, meetings, parties. You can get married in a house built on patent medicine fraud. You can host your corporate event in parlors paid for by people who believed lies. You can take your wedding photos on a porch with 17 columns, each bearing the initial of a family that profited from desperation. And most people never think about it. Why would they? The house is beautiful, but let's not pretend the story ends cleanly, because it doesn't. The Shorter Mansion still stands. It's been standing for over a century now, which is longer than Eli Orwellena lived, longer than most of the people who bought SSS Tonic, longer than the craftsmen who built it, longer than the staff who maintained it. Buildings outlast people. That's the point of buildings. You build them to transcend your own mortality, to say, I was here, I mattered. This is my mark on the world. But here's the thing about marks. They reveal character. And the Shorter Mansion reveals a very American character, the belief that wealth erases sin, that beauty justifies cost, that if something is impressive enough, we don't have to ask how it was made or who suffered for it. The patent medicine industry was a uniquely American phenomenon, a marriage of capitalism and fraud that flourished in the absence of regulation. It sold hope to people who had none, promised cures for diseases that had no cure, and made fortunes for men who knew better. And when the government finally stepped in, when the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 required honesty, the industry adapted. Some companies folded, others changed their formulas, dropped the narcotic content, softened their claims. A few, like SSS Company, survived by rebranding, by becoming legitimate, by slowly distancing themselves from their fraudulent origins. The money didn't disappear. It had already been spent. It had already bought houses, land, businesses, political influence. Eli Shorter's mansion is still standing because the money that built it was real, even if the promises that generated the money were not. And that's the tragedy, isn't it? The lies are forgotten, but the house remains. In 1972, the Shorter Mansion was added to the National Register of Historic Places. The designation recognizes buildings that have historical, architectural, or cultural significance. And the mansion does have architectural significance. It's one of the finest examples of neoclassical revival architecture in Alabama. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The design is remarkable. The preservation is meticulous. But here's what the National Register plaque doesn't say. This house was built with money from one of the 19th century's most profitable frauds. It was constructed during an era when desperate people spent their last dollars on bottles that promised miracles and delivered nothing. It was maintained by underpaid black workers whose labor kept the grandeur visible while their own lives remained invisible. It represents an economic system where wealth accumulation mattered more than human cost, where beauty covered for brutality, where a single family's comfort required the suffering of countless others. These facts aren't hidden. They're just not emphasized. The museum tour focuses on architecture, on family history, on the political prominence of the Shorter family. Eli's father was a congressman. His uncle was a governor. The house has beautiful floors and impressive columns. Look at the craftsmanship. Admire the detail. Take your pictures. And most visitors do exactly that. They walk through, they appreciate the beauty, they buy a postcard in the gift shop, and they leave. They don't ask, who paid for this? They don't ask, what did it cost? They don't ask, should we celebrate this? And maybe that's fine. Maybe we can appreciate craftsmanship while acknowledging the context. Maybe we can preserve history without endorsing it. Or maybe we're just really good at looking away from uncomfortable truths. Maybe we prefer the myth of Southern gentility, of self-made fortunes, of families who built empires through hard work and ingenuity. Maybe we don't want to think about the sick people who bought useless medicine, or the black workers who scrubbed those floors for pennies, or the craftsmen whose names nobody recorded. Maybe the house is easier to love when we don't think too hard about where it came from. The SSS Tonic Company still exists. It's now SSS Company, operating out of Atlanta. The product has changed. It's no longer marketed as a cure-all, no longer filled with unlisted ingredients, no longer making impossible promises. Modern regulations won't allow that, but the company persists, a ghost of its former self, selling topical skin treatments and claiming a heritage that stretches back to 1826. The website mentions the Creek Indian origin story, the Captain Denard legend, the long history of the brand. It doesn't mention the fraud. It doesn't talk about the Pure Food and Drug Act or why regulations became necessary. It doesn't acknowledge the desperation of the people who bought those bottles, believing they'd found a cure. History gets sanitized. The rough edges get smoothed. The story becomes simpler. A successful Southern company, a family fortune, a legacy of entrepreneurship. And in Eufaula, the Shorter Mansion stands as a monument to that sanitized version. It's beautiful. It's historic. It's a popular venue for weddings and events. It draws tourists. It contributes to the local economy. It's part of a larger historic district, a collection of 700 buildings that tell the story of antebellum wealth, Civil War survival, and post-war recovery. But if you pay attention, if you look closely, if you ask the right questions, the mansion tells a different story. It tells the story of an economic system that commodified suffering, that turned desperation into profit, that rewarded deception and punished honesty. It tells the story of a family that built a palace on lies and lived in it comfortably, never publicly questioning the source of their wealth. It tells the story of workers, craftsmen, maids, cooks, groundskeepers, whose labor made that comfort possible and whose names are lost to history. And it tells the story of a nation that built monuments to its own myths, that preserved the beautiful and erased the ugly, that celebrated grandeur while ignoring cost. The mansion is all of these things at once. It's a work of art and a crime scene. It's a historic treasure and a reminder of fraud. It's a beautiful lie. Here's what remains. 17 columns, each topped with an S. 8,700 square feet of space, mostly empty except during tours and events. Parquet floors that have lasted over a century. Mahogany and oak and walnut laid in patterns by men whose names we don't know. Marble mantels imported from distant quarries. Hand-carved moldings that took months to complete. A house that cost $100,000 and sold for $33,000. A family that rose to prominence and faded into history. A tonic company that made millions selling false hope and still operates today, rebranded and regulated. And the tourists keep coming. They walk through the rooms, admire the craftsmanship, take photos on the porch. They get married there, celebrate anniversaries, host corporate retreats. The house has become exactly what Eli Shorter wanted: a monument, a legacy, a structure that outlasts individual lives and carries forward a name. But whose name, really? The Shorters are gone. The family dynasty ended. The house belongs to the Eufaula Heritage Association now, maintained by the community, supported by ticket sales and event rentals and donations. It's public property, in a sense. It's everyone's history now, and that's both fitting and troubling. Because if it's everyone's history, then everyone shares responsibility for what it represents. We can't blame Eli Shorter alone for the fraud. He participated in a system. We can't blame the patent medicine industry alone for the lies. It operated in an unregulated market. We can't blame the craftsmen for taking the job, or the staff for needing work, or the tourists for admiring beauty. Everyone was doing what made sense in their context. But the cumulative effect, the system, the structure, the house itself, reveals something about American capitalism that's still true today. We build monuments to wealth without interrogating its origins. We celebrate grandeur while erasing the cost. We preserve beauty and call it heritage, even when that heritage includes exploitation, fraud, and suffering. The Shorter Mansion isn't an anomaly, it's a pattern, and the pattern continues. On a Sunday morning in December, you can visit the Shorter Mansion. Tours run from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., Monday through Saturday. Admission is $10 for adults, free for children and veterans. You'll walk through the front door, Pass those 17 columns with their carved S capitals and enter a world of parquet floors and elaborate moldings. The tour guide will tell you about the family, the construction, the fire of 1895, and the reconstruction. They'll point out the different wood patterns in the floors, the hand-carved sculptures, the imported marble. You'll see rooms furnished with period antiques, clothing displays from the 19th century, portraits of Alabama governors. Upstairs, there's a museum dedicated to the 6 governors from Barber County and Admiral Thomas Moorer, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The guide will talk about Eufaula's history, its role in the cotton trade, its importance during the Civil War. They'll mention that the house was built with patent medicine money, but they won't dwell on it. The focus is architectural, historical, cultural. At the end of the tour, you'll walk back out onto that porch, past those 17 columns, and stand in the Alabama heat. The house will still be standing behind you, solid and permanent, beautiful in the way that grand old houses are beautiful. And you'll have to decide, what does this house mean? Is it a testament to American craftsmanship and entrepreneurial success? Or is it a monument to fraud, built on the desperation of sick people who had no other options? Is it both? Can it be both? And if it's both, what do we do with it? Do we preserve it, celebrate it, use it for weddings and parties? Do we acknowledge the full history and let the complexity stand? Or do we tear it down, erase it, refuse to honor something built on suffering? There's no easy answer. History rarely offers easy answers. The house is beautiful. The history is ugly. Both things are true. Most people who visit the Shorter Mansion leave thinking about the architecture, maybe the family history, perhaps the broader context of Southern history and the antebellum economy. Few leave thinking about the sick people who bought useless medicine, or the workers who built the house, or the staff who maintained it for pennies. Few ask, who really paid for this? And maybe that's the point. Maybe the house exists so we don't have to ask. Maybe preservation is a form of erasure, a way of keeping the beautiful parts and discarding the rest. Or maybe it's a reminder that nothing is ever simple, that wealth always has a source, that beauty always has a cost, and that the buildings we leave behind tell the truth even when we don't want to hear it. The light shifts in Eufaula as the day ends, turning golden and soft, the way it does in the Deep South. The Chattahoochee River keeps flowing, brown and slow and indifferent, same as it did 200 years ago when this town was just a creek village on a bluff. The mansion's columns cast long shadows across North Eufaula Avenue. Inside, the parquet floors still shine. The marble mantels are still cold to the touch. The S on those column capitals still says, Shorter. Remember this name. We were here. But what are we remembering? Are we remembering Eli Sims Shorter too, cotton broker and patent medicine heir, who built a palace and died at 49? Are we remembering Wilena, who lived 19 years alone in those echoing rooms after he died? Are we remembering the craftsmen who laid those floors, whose names we don't know? Are we remembering the staff who polished them for decades, whose labor kept the grandeur visible? Are we remembering the people who bought SSS? Tonic, who believed the promises, who spent money they couldn't spare, who died without the cure they were promised? Or are we just remembering a house, a beautiful house, an impressive house, a house with 17 columns and elaborate moldings and floors that took 5 years to complete, a house that cost $100,000 in 1906 and sold for $33,000 in 1965, a house that's now a museum, a wedding venue, a tourist attraction, a monument to something we can't quite name. The question isn't whether the house should stand. It's standing. The question is what story we tell about it, and who we remember when we walk through those doors, and whether we're willing to acknowledge the full cost of beauty. Because the house isn't going anywhere. It's been standing for over a century. It'll probably stand for another. Long after we're gone, tourists will still walk those floors, admire those columns, take their pictures. And the house will remain what it's always been, a monument built on bottles of false hope, preserved because we find it easier to celebrate beauty than to confront the price that was paid for it. The Shorter Mansion stands. The sick people who bought the tonic are long dead. The craftsmen who built it are forgotten. The workers who maintained it are invisible. The family dynasty ended. And the house remains, beautiful and terrible, A reminder that everything we build leaves a stain, and some stains, no matter how carefully we polish the surface, never quite disappear. Who paid the price for this palace? The answer is in the floors, in the columns, in the silence between the tour guide's carefully chosen words. The answer is in what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. And the house knows. It's always known. That's why it's still standing, not in spite of its history, but because of it. A monument to the American belief that if something is beautiful enough, we don't have to ask where it came from, or who suffered to build it, or what it cost them to pay for our comfort. The house stands, and we let it stand. And that tells you everything you need to know about who we are and what we value, and what we're willing to overlook when the columns are impressive enough and the floors shine just right in the afternoon light.